This is Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.
I shudder thinking how the world can be so cruel. Lend my voice to those who can. It's time we try, it's time we care, it's time we stand. It starts with a voice.
Welcome to the Special Chronicles show. My name is Daniel Smrokowski. I'm the founder of Special Chronicles and the Special Olympics Southern Tribal International Global Messenger. Our website, specialchronicles.com, where you can stream our archives of over 750 episodes absolutely for free. And to follow Special Chronicles on social media, Apple Podcast, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to your podcast. This week on the Special Chronicles show, Augustus Jorge Hernandez-Perez, the 2021 Southeast Youth of the Year with the Boys and Girls Club of America, and a student at Columbia University. Jorge is here to talk about his story from Cuba to Columbia University, which includes sharing the stage with First Lady of the United States of America, Dr. Joe Biden. So please put your virtual hands together as we welcome Jorge on the Special Chronicles show, specialchronicles.com. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, it's good to have you on. And I guess as before we get into your story, maybe we could kind of briefly have you share with the listeners how we got connected, because I think it was last October, I believe, 2022, we were on stage together in Atlanta at the Coca-Cola headquarters. So I don't know if you kind of want to recount how to share with our listeners how we got connected.
So first of all, thank you for clarifying that it's Columbia University. Every single time I tell someone, or every single time someone asks me where I'm going to college and I say Columbia, they always think the country. Fine. So you're right. We did get together and we did organize the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit. I had gotten an invitation to the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit about 2 weeks prior to the actual summit because another Boys and Girls Club youth had pulled out. And so I was a little worried about who was going to be on my panel. And I think we met virtually about a week before the summit. And you were telling your story and you were telling your experiences. And it was absolutely so thrilling and heartwarming to hear. We then got to the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit, and we were on a youth panel together. It was me, you, and I think 3 other youth.
Yes.
Every single time you would say something, and every single time you would bring up your experiences and how you lived authentically via your experiences, it was something that everyone in the audience, and you can tell everyone in the audience looked up to. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that at the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit. Afterwards, the summit talked a lot about social identity, and they talked a lot about what it means to be a youth in America today, what it means to be part of this generation that is hoping for significant systemic change in our country. And so you touched a lot about what it means to have a disability and what it means to be an individual with a disability. I talked about equitable education, and there was so much overlap in that because education, the education system, not only target students of color and low-income students, but also students with disabilities. And so we were able to have a lot of dialogue backstage afterwards, and it was just fantastic meeting you, and now we're here.
Yeah, so I know.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was awesome meeting you, and the same thing that week before, meeting virtually, and then talking backstage and talking on stage and hearing your story of really, which I think is kind of the foundation of bringing you on this podcast, is all 3 of your identities and your formative years shaped you as a human. And I think what hopefully all listeners will gain from this conversation today is that every human, and using your story as an example this week, every human has different identities that form them from their younger years throughout their education, to whether it's their heritage, whether it's disability, whether it's just any identity that each human and that's what I think really also kind of tying that back to the Coca-Cola Community Engagement Summit. All of us, and I'm probably on the a little older side of the youth, but without aging myself too much. But what I just said of kind of how this episode is kind of focused on, all of our stories, like you said, overlapped, and all of our stories kind of have that theme of each of our different identities, whether it's your story, my story, Mackenzie's story, each of our stories kind of shaped each of us as a human, and that's the impact that our younger generation, that I think so much of the audience there really took away from the summit, is that each of our stories, that's the impact that will the future, if we just take time to listen to our stories. And I think that's what's so powerful about podcasts. And this podcast, for example, is that we're taking the time, and yes, we're doing video too, but particularly audio. But if people take the time, whether it's on a podcast, whether we're on stage speaking on a panel at a summit in Atlanta or wherever, when people take time to listen to our stories, then that's the impact that I think that we can have in the future.
Yeah, I also think that our generation particularly is so informed and so aware of how their particular identities can not only shape their experiences, but shape their viewpoint throughout life. And I'm going to talk about this later on in the interview.
Yeah.
But it's basically going to be this thing of how do we live authentically, and how do we make sure that our environment and the external conditions that we grow up on don't fully shape who we are, but how do we also give in a little and understand that who we are is shaped by our environment and by our identities interacting with those around us. So I think our generation is fully aware of that. And so I do have a lot of hope for future leaders of our generation.
Awesome. Yeah, me too. So I love that you touched on that. And now as we kind of move into your story, so can you tell us a little bit about your early years? Because I found it really empowering to when in getting to know you about what was it 9 months ago when we were together in Atlanta, hearing your story. Can you kind of share with our listeners your childhood growing up in Cuba and you and your family coming to America?
Yeah, so I was born in Santa Clara, Cuba, and I had my entire family there. And then I came to the United States when I was 7.5. I came to Sarasota, Florida, and started attending public school there. And I lived with my mother and with my grandmother at that time. And so in Cuba, I had my father, who was a very formative figure for me, and I had my aunt, who was also a very formative figure for me. I like to say that throughout my life, I have been raised by incredibly independent and powerful women, and that's really shaped my perspective on how I'm supposed to approach the world and with what vigor I approach the world. My aunt, every single time we would have a conversation, she would always repeat a very, very similar statement again and again. I never want you to alter a particular part of who you are in order to make other people happy or in order to make other people more proud of you. I think that there was an understanding during my childhood that I was gay, particularly from my aunt. And of course, this LGBTQ plus identity was not fully accepted in Cuba. And so there was a lot of stigma that came with it. And my aunt was one of the few people who not only understood this, but didn't shove it aside and didn't completely ignore it. She came up to me and she reminded me every day to not conceal parts of myself in order to seek acceptance. And so those communications with my aunt were very formative, particularly for a young gay man who was just coming to terms with a sexual identity. I then came to the United States. And then I had to leave my aunt back, which was really heartbreaking because this woman had raised me from when I was born. And so I came to the United States with my mother and with my grandmother, and I was enrolled in the public education system of Sarasota, Florida. I went to Wilkinson Elementary, which is the most underfunded and under-resourced school in Sarasota, Florida. And my mother was working 3 full-time jobs at the time, I like to say. She was a nurse, or she was studying to be a nurse. She was in nursing school. She was working at the airport full-time, and she was a mother full-time to my little sister and I. And so, again, these experiences with my mother working extremely hard to give me the future that she didn't have, with me attending a public education system that I knew there was something wrong with, I just couldn't put my hand on it, with leaving my family behind, the immigrant story of adapting and altering who you are to fit into a new country. All these experiences can really shape an individual. And it all started back in Cuba with my Cuban heritage and with the immigrant experience, which I think can be a collective experience for a lot of immigrants in America, learning a new language, coming to a country that you have no idea about, making new friends. And so that's just a little.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing your story, and we'll get into a little bit more of your formative years, and in particular, how your identities have shaped you as an individual, have shaped you as a human in society. And then how an organization such as the Boys and Girls Club of America have helped you to get to where you are today. Because when we have organizations, whether it's like for yourself, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, whether it's a Special Olympics, like for myself, when we have these organizations that support us and with these resources, that's another impact that kind of helps to shape us as an individual, as a human. So we'll get into much more of your story in this episode after we take a short break. Our guest is Jorge from a student at Columbia University that we want to continue to emphasize, and hopefully, if I remember to update the graphic for this episode, we will make sure. But if we don't, then listeners, all the thousands of you listeners will know just by listening to the beginning of this episode. So hopefully, yes. We'll be right back right here on SpecialChronicles.com. Support for Special Chronicles comes from listeners like you. As an independent public media podcast, Special Chronicles will always be there for you. Now we're asking you to be there for us. As a nonprofit independent media organization, we can only make programs like Special Chronicles with listener support. Our programs provide weekly, candid, honest, and inspiring conversations about the people with disabilities community that creates awareness, support, and advocacy within each week's episode. Listeners tell us our shows are an enjoyable and necessary podcast for the intellectual and developmental disability community and everyone else who is able to listen to stories about life from a different angle. Please, if you and your family love our weekly podcast, Make a one-time, monthly, or annual gift of thanks today. Support this podcast at specialchronicles.com/give. That's specialchronicles.com/give. Our guest is Jorge, a student at Columbia University. And so now that our listeners kind of have had that background of sorry, my dad was peeping his head into the studio. and see, here's the thing. We just came back 30 seconds ago from that break, right? Yeah. If only he would have if he would have popped his head into the studio a minute ago. But then again, as you and our viewers can tell, I'm wearing headphones, and so he doesn't know. What?
Is he still there?
No, he's just leaving right now.
To meet him.
Yeah. So next time. Anyways, so because I think you met him when we were in Atlanta. Okay. So because he was there. I think he was at one of the tables right in front of the stage that we were on. Anyways, now that our listeners have kind of had a introduction to your early years, can you kind of tell us a little bit about how your formative years and your identity, and kind of give us kind of a brief a brief glimpse of your identities, your Cuba heritage identity, your ADHD diagnosis in high school, and then your gay identity. Kind of in, because I think in our pre-show, which I think our pre-show was a couple months ago, but we you had kind of talked about that your identities were in that order, and in the first segment you talked about that Cuba. So now kind of if we were able to kind of take our listeners on kind of through your story, so that you talked about your Cuba heritage, and now kind of if we kind of continue in with your story, can you kind of talk about those other two identities? And
so I mentioned that I came from Cuba and that I attended the public education system in Sarasota, Florida. And I think the first experience that really woke me up, or that really gave me some insight into how exactly an immigrant would traverse the United States of America, was the public education system. I was a Spanish speaker first and foremost. I did not know any English, so I had to go into the ESOL classrooms. And in those classrooms, I realized that my ESOL instructor didn't really have the time to fully educate me in English. I also realized that my ESOL instructor was focused on so many other students and didn't really have the proper training to focus on English instruction. I knew there was something wrong with this, and so I started learning English by myself. I would come home every night, and my mother would pull out a ginormous English to Spanish dictionary, and she would put Jane Eyre in front of me. And I would flip through literally every page, learning every single word and trying to understand the meaning of the text. So that's really how I learned English, and I was starting to grapple with what it means to be an immigrant in the United States, particularly a low-income immigrant who goes to a school that can't really support his endeavors. When I was in middle school, I was eating lunch, and my grandmother, who I lived with, had made me some plantains, some rice, some beans, and some chicken. This is the meal that I ate literally every night for dinner, and my grandmother thought, why not make it lunch? So I brought it to school in a container. I opened it up, and then a person sitting next to me looks at the food and said, that looks disgusting. It is those particular moments. I want you to picture this moment in which I have ate this my entire life. My family has served this their entire life from generation to generation. It is literally part of my Cuban heritage, and someone disregards it like that. And so I do want you to picture that moment, because I think part of being an immigrant is the stigmatization that comes about your cultural heritage and your cultural context. In high school, I was also diagnosed with ADHD, and I think that a lot of times that really brought me to the disability, and specifically the disability justice movement. I started looking into how the ADA was passed, into how individuals with disabilities were treated throughout American history, and into how their rights were tolerated and even expanded in the early 1990s. I think with ADHD, it is a very specific form of an invisible disability. And so the experiences are often not known by the people not feeling it. And so, for example, ADHD, yes, it's a distraction from certain tasks and from certain schoolwork, but as you mature, that capacity to be distracted goes away, and it starts formalizing into more significant social barriers that you have to cross. I think for me, the most significant one is the 9-to-5 job. I cannot sit still for like 8 hours of my day focusing on a particular task. I'm going to need movement and I'm going to need motion. That's just an example. And then you mentioned how in high school, I also started to come to terms with what being gay means, and exactly specifically what being a gay Cuban immigrant means in a very conservative and Christian nationalist state of Florida. A lot of times I would have conversations that were either homophobic microaggressions or just detriments to me coming out and fully expressing who I was. All of these identities from elementary school to high school shaped who I was. But the most important point that I want to emphasize, Daniel, is that when we are growing up and when we are young, we have this capacity and this tendency to think about the impossible and the possible. What I mean by that is when I came to the United States, I was told about the American dream. The American dream is anyone who comes to this country can work hard, can throw themselves at their work, and they will succeed and they will accomplish. And everything seemed to be possible. As I traverse my life, specifically through the education system, through the experiences that I've had with fellow students, with educators that didn't have the training, with schools that didn't have the funding, I started to realize that a lot of the American dream was actually impossible, that the American dream oftentimes presents itself as something that everyone can achieve, but only a select few with the economic resources, with the class background, with the racial and ethnic background can actually achieve it. And so as I got older, I realized that certain things were not going to be possible unless I made them possible. I think that the job of public service and the job of government is to turn the impossible into the possible. And that's something that I'm really trying to dedicate my life to. And that's something that I'm really trying to focus my attention on, specifically with my experiences.
Awesome. I loved what you said about toning the impossible into the possible, and really hopefully in educators, in both educators and government leaders can kind of heal that what you just said, that people think of the American dream as one thing, but when, like what you and your story, what you discovered was that that's not true. And so and I think by hearing your story and hearing those stories of how we can make the impossible possible, do you think that's how we can make change happen? Like, I'm going to kind of touch on that that we maybe we may touch on this at the end of the episode, but it kind of fits into what we'll talk about now. So, like, do you think that it's possible to change the impossible to the possible in kind of healing all those stories?
Yeah, I think that stories are a good way to constitute this idea of dissent, of disagreeing with current institutions or with current systems. I think that every time we share an experience, I think that every time we share an identity, I think that every time we share a story, particularly in this podcast with so many viewers, we are expressing dissent and distaste with current institutions. I think that whoever is listening can not only empathize with stories, but stories have a particular capacity to allow other people to put themselves in their shoes. This is why some of the most significant social change that has happened throughout history has been because of movies, has been because of literature, has been because of podcasts like these. And so, if we're talking about the capacity of stories to really turn the impossible into the possible, that can serve a very big role in our society. The other thing I was going to say is that every protest and every dissent that we see throughout this nation is not only a disagreement with current institutions, but it's a new generation trying to form themselves and trying to be a part of American history and trying to form a generational identity in American history. And so every protest that we see, every story that we tell disagreeing with something also forms an identity and also makes an identity more public. And so I think you have those two things of holding institutions accountable, but also allowing you to express yourself. And I think that stories have such an important role in both of those aspects.
Awesome. I love that. And also kind of add in to that is when we hold these institutions accountable, then we'll, while also kind of taking our stories and like you said, forming in identity, people are able to really get to know us and understand our stories. And tying that back to our disability community, I think a lot of times, and this over, past 15 years, over 700 episodes, people all, I think the first time when, and the same thing with any identity that we have, people focus on our challenges. People focus on that first identity of, I guess, almost like a negative viewpoint. And even some of the identities that kind of shape you, I think that first, and I think part of that probably has to do with a lot of the institutions focus on that negative, the negative side of our disability, the negative side of whatever identity that we identify with. Whereas when people get to hear our stories, when they're hearing your story on this podcast, when they hear my story or any of the stories of the guests that we have, or just anybody's story, we're able to kind of hopefully change that mindset. The guest, well, we recorded this in the middle of April, so this past week's guest talked about inclusive mindsets and really how, for example, like this podcast is a perfect example of building and understanding inclusive mindsets. And I think we can kind of tie that into your story, that if we're able to kind of understand inclusive mindsets in our stories, then that's a way that we can hopefully change. So then hopefully in later years down the road, whether it's for the next generation or kind of in American history further down the road, we can hopefully maybe not even have those, well, the first thing that people see when they see our identities, they see our disability, that negative side is not even part of the conversation. Do you want to maybe kind of touch on that? Like, do you think that's possible? Or?
Yeah, so I'm going to take your example of disability and how disability has been perceived throughout American history. First, we started with the medical model of disability, and that started because there was a lot of scientists who were doing medical research on what it means to be neurodivergent, on what it means, on the experiences and the barriers that people with other forms of disability have. And a lot of times I feel that with disability specifically, that medical model led to a lot of stigmatization. And there was an understanding in the American public that individuals with disabilities could not do X, Y, and Z, or could not thrive socially and economically because of their disability. What I loved about the passage of the ADA and the 20 years that followed after the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act is that we started to turn the medical model of disability into the social model of disability. We started to not only see disability in a positive context, but we also started to realize something else. The barriers that individuals with disabilities face, whether that's an invisible disability like neurodivergence, or whether that's a physical and very visible disability, the barriers that individuals with disabilities face are not because of the disability, but they are because of social barriers put in place. Disability is intrinsically not a negative thing, but it becomes a negative aspect of one's life because there are social institutions and social barriers that inhibit someone from doing a particular task. I talked about the 9-to-5 workplace and how that might not always work with people with ADHD. That's not because ADHD is intrinsically bad. It's because the 9-to-5 workplace is set up in a place that's not really conducive to everyone's identities. And so this idea of taking the negative out of disability and taking the negative out of identity, and instead understanding that one's social identity inhibits one's capacity for economic security, for social mobility, not because of the identity, but because of social structures is so important. We can apply this to anything else. Race is not an inhibitor. Racism is an inhibitor. Xenophobia is the inhibitor, not Latinos not being an inhibitor to economic security. And so I think that what you touched upon on how we paint in a negative light certain identities is so important.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. And of all there's going to be a lot that our listeners can learn from your story, but I think what you and I just touched on in this kind of around this 30-minute milk of this conversation, that is going to be so a powerful takeaway for our listeners to kind of come away from this episode, that not just listening to us talk for an hour, but really coming away to make, like, we don't just get on a podcast just to talk. We get on to share our stories to make change happen, to make social justice happen. Moving on, before we take our next break, can you kind of wrap up this kind of segment of talking about your identities? Can you share with us how your identities and how has it shaped you as an individual and you as a human in society? How has all of this, if you were to kind of sum that up into how your identities have shaped you as an individual in society?
Yeah, and I'll make sure to be quick because I know you have a sponsor break coming up.
Yes.
But, whenever I think about this, there's always two conflicting points. One of living authentically, and that basically means of living with authenticity in your life. It means there should be no external impediments or boundaries to what you can and cannot do. And so your identity, who you are as an individual, should be purely decided by you within your individual sphere. There should be no influence externally. But then there's this thing of how social barriers form us. And those with different identities experience society in such a different way. And so we have this of authenticity, how we should be ourselves without anyone telling us who to be, and B, that's nearly impossible in an American society for those who maintain an identity that has systemic and structural inequities that come along with it. And so I've been trying to grapple with these two contradictory statements, how I can be myself, but also myself is always defined by an other, by someone else around me, or by an external power. As I think about this more, I'm starting, and as I'm coming to consciousness, I'm starting to realize that both of these can coexist in a very, very beautiful way. I think that I found the capacity to live authentically, even though I didn't attend the best public schools, or even though I woke up at 4 a.m. and my mother was studying and folding laundry at the same time. I think that one's capacity to live authentically is made harder by the social barriers that you face with your identity, whether it's ADHD, whether it's being gay, or whether it's having another social identity. But eventually, as you come to consciousness, the struggle of one's life is making sure that those social barriers don't define who you are and that you live authentically. And so I hope that sums it up, but it's really those two contradictory things that I have to come to terms with.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot more that we probably could cover, but for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and take our next break. When we come back, we'll transition a little bit to talking about the Boys and Girls Club of America, as well as then we'll take another break, and then after the break, we'll get into final thoughts, and we'll conclude with having you talk about lessons that you learned when you share the stage with Dr. Joe Biden. We'll leave our listeners, hopefully all of you listening will keep listening to the end of this episode to hear the lessons that our First Lady taught you, Jorge. And so we'll be right back right here on specialchronicles.com. Support for Special Chronicles comes from ComEd. Special Chronicles is proud to partner with the ComEd Energy Force Ambassador Program. The Energy Force is the country's first energy efficiency education program designed for and taught by people with disabilities. ComEd is powering lives and really is powering us here at Special Chronicles to keep the lights on and our technology is powered on. As ComEd powers the lives of us, they are literally giving a voice to people with special needs. We thank ComEd for the generous support of our mission at Special Chronicles. Learn more at specialchronicles.com/ComEd. That's specialchronicles.com/ComEd. Support for Special Chronicles comes from United Airlines Bridge Disability Business Resource Group. Special Chronicles is proud to partner with United Airlines and the Bridge BLG. Bridge BLG is committed to being an ally for all employees and customers with disabilities. Bridge helps to create internal awareness to keep accessibility needs in mind and partner with key organizations to empower disability inclusion for employment and travel. Bridge, connecting people of all abilities. Book your travel today on United.com or on the award-winning United app. Learn more on United's commitment to disability inclusion for employment and travel at specialchronicles.com/United. That's specialchronicles.com/United. Our guest is Jorge, student from Columbia University. And before we get into I really wish I would have faded that down. Anyways, before we get into the main topic that we have planned for this third segment, I want to kind of touch on something briefly from what you talked about in the last segment when you're talking about we kind of focused on the ADA and disability, and that is there's a lot of talk now about being inclusive and really how inclusion and being accessible. I know like a lot of times at United Airlines we talk about being the leading airline that's most accessible, most inclusive, and I guess I think we can kind of maybe even tie that into the beginning part of your story. You want to maybe kind of comment on when we talk about how your identities have shaped you as a human in society. How does trying to be accessible, trying to be inclusive, how does that kind of play into what we talked about in the last segment, with kind of changing from instead of like these institutions having this negative viewpoint of our identities, how does trying to be like the leading inclusive, accessible organization, or maybe even institution, how does that factor into how we are changing all younger generation?
Yeah. So I think that this notion of accessibility, specifically when we're talking about disability, is an understanding from institutions, from governmental and public institutions, and also from private corporations like United Airlines, that individuals with disability can actually achieve full economic and social potential if given the capacity by organizations to have more power in society. So when we're talking about accessibility, I think a lot of times there is this idea that what accommodations an individual with disability should have, or what accessibility should be given to the general public of individuals with disabilities, often does not include the individual with disability in the conversation. And so if you think about it, we have these significantly large corporations trying to make something accessible without including the individuals in the conversation that they're trying to help in the first place. I do think that originally this idea of who we're going to give accommodations to, what the accommodations are going to be, comes from an understanding that anyone, regardless of social identity, has the potential to contribute to the workplace and has the potential to contribute to public life. I do hope that going forward, more invisible disabilities become part of accommodations. I know that ADHD and education and testing requirements and extensions and testing is a very big conversation right now. And I also hope that in general, when corporations are making this decision on accessibility, on what we're going to do to create more inclusive environments for individuals with disabilities, the individuals with disabilities are actually part of the conversation.
Yeah, awesome. I love that. And I think, and I guess maybe partly because United is also a sponsor of this podcast, and partly because they're also my employer. I probably should be careful kind of what I say, but I say that to say, I think partly for, and I guess I also want to preface this with saying, I'm not just saying this so I can still have a job. I'm saying this because I know what, believe me?
Yes.
Yeah. I know that, I'm saying this because I know it's like firsthand. I know from firsthand experience that it's true, that I know that United Airlines, for example, is having these conversations of including those of us with disabilities in trying to be accessible.
Yeah. And
then I'm sure that those other institutions that, and we don't have to give necessarily names on this podcast. And I mean, I know firsthand that there are some other institutions, I'm sure you know as well, that are not like that. And so I think what we need to do probably, and I'm sure you would agree, that we need to educate them. And part of that probably also falls in the education system, but also kind of taking that education into these institutions to educate them about our stories. For the sake of time, we're going to move on and kind of combine kind of a few of these bullets into kind of one bullet, and maybe we don't have to spend a lot of time on the Boys and Girls Club of America, because I think the main point of this episode is focused on your story from Cuba to Columbia University. Can you kind of just tell us briefly how you got involved in the Boys and Girls Club of America and receiving the Southeast Youth of the Year in 2021, and how these opportunities led to you today to be becoming a student at Columbia?
Yeah, so I was in my sophomore year of high school, and I was looking for a summer program to participate in order to improve my college application and also get some work experience. I went up to my mother and I asked her about a particular summer program that I was interested in. And the summer program was with the Boys and Girls Clubs of Sarasota and DeSoto counties. And it was a leadership and civic engagement program. The first question my mother asked me was, how much is it going to be? Because she could not finance something that was completely expensive just because we didn't have the financial resources. I told her it was going to be $25, but the fee could be waived. The Boys and Girls Club waived the fee for me after I explained to them my economic situation. Then we went to the orientation of the program, and the orientation was mandatory for participation in the summer program. The orientation started, I believe, at 6 p.m. on a Thursday night. My mom always worked late on Thursdays until like 7:30 p.m. And so she called me at 5:30. She said, we're going to be late. I'm so sorry. I know the orientation is mandatory. There's nothing I can do about it. I, of course, didn't blame her. She picked me up. We sped down like 20 roads to the Boys and Girls Club. And my thought throughout the entire car ride was, this is going to be another missed opportunity, because I had missed the orientation. When we got there, my mom and I started running into the doors of the Boys and Girls Club. The mentor who was giving the presentation at the orientation stopped what she was doing. She came to the door and held the door open for my mother and I. It was not a missed opportunity, because the Boys and Girls Club understood that there are going to be students in these situations, and that those students deserve to have the capacity to grow in the workplace, to grow their resume, and to grow their college application as well. That really got me involved in the Boys and Girls Club, and it led me to becoming the Southeast Youth of the Year for the organization in 2021. There was another point that I'm going to touch upon briefly, but at the Boys and Girls Club, there's a big emphasis on education. A lot of times, because the students attending the Boys and Girls Club are low-income students of color that attend underfunded, under-resourced schools. And so the Boys and Girls Club almost served as another secondary institution where they could get the education that they missed out on because the public education system could not support them. I think that an organization that understands the importance of education for social mobility and the importance of education for future economic security of its students is an organization worth keeping in America. The Boys and Girls Club, my point is that the Boys and Girls Club helped me, but also helped so many other students in worse economic conditions than me, who had significantly less privilege than me. And so, I mean, when we talk about the Boys and Girls Club, yes, it's part of my story, but I think it's also part of the story in American history.
Awesome. And I love what you said, and they kind of tied briefly back to the beginning where we talked about how we got connected. The morning of the summit, when so I sat down. Actually, my dad and I sat down there at breakfast, and one of the people that sat down next to us was, I believe, the CEO of the Boys and Girls Club of America. Yeah. And so it was neat to have a conversation with him. I don't remember totally everything that we talked about, but it was, and I loved how you summed up the purpose of the Boys and Girls Club of America. We're going to take another short break, just 1 minute. I believe it should be just a 1 minute break. When we come back, we'll get into your future career goals and the conversation with our First Lady of the United States, Dr. Joe Biden, will be coming up after this final break right here on specialchronicles.com. Special Chronicles is hosted by Podbean Podcast Hosting, the easiest, most affordable option to get started in podcasting. At Special Chronicles, we proudly host a weekly podcast with Podbean and highly recommend you use Podbean podcast hosting to get started in podcasting today. Sign up for an unlimited hosting plan and get 1 month free now to get started in podcasting today when you visit specialchronicles.com/Podbean. That's specialchronicles.com/Podbean. Our live streams are powered by StreamYard, the easiest way to create professional live streams. StreamYard is a live streaming studio in your browser. Interview guests, share your screen, and much more. Stream directly to Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and other platforms. Sign up for StreamYard today using our StreamYard referral link when you visit specialchronicles.com/StreamYard. That's specialchronicles.com/StreamYard. Our guest is Jorge, a student from Columbia University, and in this final segment, we're going to try to cover this in just our last 10 minutes here. But can you tell us a little bit about your future career goals in public policy and education? I think it relates to a lot of what we talked about already. I think your formative years have kind of shaped the career that you would like to have. Can you tell us a little bit about future career?
I am studying public health at Columbia University. What I love about public health is that it is not only COVID-19 and pandemics and epidemics individual nations are going through, but there's also this big conversation about the social determinants of health and how housing, how economic condition, how race, ethnicity, immigration status, the education you obtained, where you live, what neighborhood you live, the transportation you have access to can all impact your health and can all impact your opportunity. So I'm loving that I'm getting this education at Columbia University because I think it's covering all the aspects of American society that I would love to involve myself in as a public servant. My goal right now is public policy and really joining government in whatever capacity. I do believe that public policy has the capacity to touch most lives it does require a lot of effort, but you can generalize a policy and you can impact a significant number of individuals. And so that's really where I'm heading right now with my career. Hopefully I can get there. I'm very excited about the prospect of learning about the different issues, particularly social issues in America, and bridging a lot of the economic, racial, and ethnic gaps that we see.
Awesome. And you recently had a 10-minute conversation backstage with First Lady of the United States of America, Dr. Joe Biden, and the image for this episode. If you guys are listening on specialchronicles.com or the thumbnail on YouTube or our Instagram page or Spotify, Apple Podcast will be a picture of you on stage with Dr. Joe Biden. Can you kind of share with us what lessons that Dr. Joe Biden taught you?
Yeah, so I was introducing her on stage at the Summit for America's Youth that the Boys and Girls Club was holding. And I had previously given this 5-minute keynote on equitable education, how students are impacted, but also the different public policies from local school funding formulas to the property tax, to state funding, to how federal government gives funding to schools that get better test scores, only reinvigorating and reproducing this system of inequity in our education system. I gave this whole keynote on equal opportunity in our education system. And it was kind of a sad keynote because afterward, I was realizing that this issue is so wicked because it has so many layers of complexity and nuance in different policy systems from local to state to federal with the No Child Left Behind Act that completely decimated the education system. And so afterward, I was a little hopeless. I was, if I'm going to admit, a little sad about the state of American education. And Dr. Jill Biden came backstage as I was waiting to introduce her. We took pictures, we shook hands, and then we had a conversation in which I felt the comfort to be very frank with her. And I told her about these feelings of despair, of hopelessness. but also of possibility. And it goes back to this idea of turning the impossible into the possible, and what mindset future leaders have to have when they're trying to do just that. She told me two things that I think are going to stick with me for the rest of my life. One is that as I am going into this world and as I am coming to consciousness in this world of social inequities and economic insecurity and so many social issues, I have to go in it with this idea of quiet laughter. I cannot let these particular issues get to me in a way of anger or bitterness, or there's absolutely no way to actually solve them. And so that's going to stick with me, because whenever I find myself overthinking about a particular issue or feeling down because the state of our country is so far from the vision that we had when it was first formed, not even from the vision that we had when it was first formed, there was no actual positive vision in the beginning, but the state of our country in general, that's going to stick with me. And the other thing that she said that was very, very important is that when we're looking at history gives us the opportunity to analyze how certain issues came to be and to understand what mistakes we have made, particularly in ascribing certain traits and ascribing certain things that are inaccurate to certain populations and to certain groups. So she really focused on the importance of history and an education in history. She's an educator, an English educator, so she really understands the issues. And so she told me that history, if I'm going to study it, I should study it, because it's going to give me the capacity to have a receptacle into the past and to understand why we got here, how we're here, and how to avoid what's currently happening. And so just those two notes that she gave were so important and were so formative for me.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing. I'm sure there's a lot more that we could cover there, but I'm sure those lessons will hopefully all listeners can now kind of learn from Dr. Joe Biden on through you from her. Can you share with us just some social media plugs on where our listeners can follow you on Instagram, as well as the Boys and Girls Club of America?
Yeah, so first of all, follow the Boys and Girls Clubs of America on Instagram, go on their website, keep up with what they're doing, and if you can, either volunteer or financially support the organization, because again, this organization is fundamental to American history and to American society. It is quite literally bridging the gaps that I talked about this entire interview. So first and foremost, go to the Boys and Girls Club and support them in whatever way you can. And then also, if you want, follow me on Instagram. My @ is Jorge F. Hernandez with 2 Z's at the end. But yes, really the focus is the Boys and Girls Club.
Awesome. And we'll put links in the show notes on specialchronicles.com for this episode. I believe it will be episode 526. Just go wherever you're listening to this, is click the link in the show notes. And from there, for this episode website, you can all of you can find the link to the Boys and Girls Club of America to follow them, donate, as well as follow Jorge if you would like on Instagram. Any final thoughts on your overall time here today on the Special Chronicles show?
I mean, this was absolutely fantastic. Your questions were amazing. They brought out so much insight and so much information. And I think that the biggest takeaway from today is how we can turn the impossible into the possible by making sure that we acknowledge that social identities aren't the issue, but social barriers are the issue.
Awesome. And with that, we're going to conclude with one final question, and that is, to introduce that, we've got a... Oh, whoops, sorry, I played the wrong clip. Here we go, let's go ahead and play that bumper.
We're not just athletes.
We are the ambassadors of an uprising. Peaceful protesters.
In a rebellion against anyone
who has a fear of difference.
Difference.
Our demands are
equality,
dignity, and the recognition of our shared humanity.
We will not stop or accept anything less.
Today, our world is
more divided than ever, and coming together has never been more urgent.
The revolution is inclusion. Find out more at jointherevolution.org.
And ever since I attended the 2019 Special Olympics World Games in Abu Dhabi, for the past 5 years, I've been asking all the guests the one final question, so I'll do the same with you, Jorge. as you know, the inclusion revolution is a big part of Special Olympics. It's also kind of defined as what our conversation was kind of about today. And so I ask you, what does inclusion mean to you?
Oh my goodness, this is a difficult question because it literally means so many things. But I think that when I think about inclusion, I think about the birth of a human being and acknowledging the equal human dignity of every single human being on this planet. I think that means giving equal opportunity and equitable rights to all individuals who are born by virtue of them just being human. The other thing, so that's first and foremost what I think about when I think about inclusion. The other thing is the conversation can also shift from inclusion and from acceptance into the actual toppling of systemic inequities, because I think inclusion is so part of the solution and can play a significant role in the solution, but also making sure that equal opportunity can be achieved by breaking down the barriers set by institutions. And I think inclusion is the most formative and the most important part of that idea and breaking down those barriers. But I also think that comes with policy and making sure that we abolish certain institutions that have in American history serve no other purpose but perpetuating hate. And so those two things of equal dignity and equal human dignity, but also taking it further and breaking down the barriers that we see.
I love what you said. That's a perfect way to wrap up this episode. And I know we are at the 1 hour mark, and so but I did kind of want to. I don't usually add on to the guests, but I kind of want to, because I love what you said. So I kind of want to add on that it ties in with a quote that I said a couple years ago, and that is that hate can be met by love. And I go on in the quote to say that us Special Olympics athletes show love to people that show us hate. But I guess that first part of that quote that I said, that hate can be met by love, I think your story, what you shared today, is a perfect example of that. And yeah, I don't know if you want to. I know we're over the hour mark now, but I don't know if you want to comment on, because that kind of, I think, kind of wraps up this conversation. But I don't know if you want to add on to that.
I think that when we're talking about how to combat hate, and particularly how hate is so ingrained in the systems that we have in America today, this notion that those who are feeling the unjust impacts of the system can't fight back with love is more true now than ever. But I also think hate can't be met with love is my first reaction. It's what Joe Biden told me when I was in despair, to uplift my spirits, to meet the worlds of current social barriers with quiet laughter. The other thing I can say, though, is that we can get a little mad when something is unfair. I think that it's perfectly valid and perfectly acceptable to express anger and to express distaste with what's going on. Of course, the end goal is equal human dignity for all of us and expressing love and equal respect for every single one of us. And so I think that when we're talking about hate in our institutions, the end goal is love. But in the process, you can fight back and you can express disagreement, respectful disagreement, which I think touches on both of those aspects.
Awesome. I love that. That's a perfect way to wrap up. I'm sure we'll have to have you on again, one of our previous guests. We concluded with a cliffhanger so I think we'll probably have to have you on again to kind of continue this conversation. So we'll be in touch. And for those of you listening, I know we went a few minutes over the hour, but it's been a joy. It's always a joy talking to you, and it's always, I mean, I enjoyed talking to you so much backstage when we were in Atlanta, that I was like, we had to kind of bring that to the podcast. So thank you for taking the time to come on the Special Chronicles show.
Thank you for having me. It was fantastic. Your questions were fantastic. You're a fantastic host. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And for those of you listening, be sure to keep following the Special Chronicles podcast, or tap that follow button on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows, as new episodes drop weekly. And don't miss our original content that will help you make impactful and inclusive connections in your life through our podcast. And remember to visit our website, specialchronicles.com. That's specialchronicles.com. Where you can stream our archives of over 730 episodes absolutely for free, and to follow Special Chronicles on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and as well as to follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere you listen to your favorite shows. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you. Sorry, I'm trying to find the right bumper. There we go. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you next week right here on specialchronicles.com. And until then, remember, choose to include, and disabled voices matter.
Special Chronicles, giving respect and a voice to people with special needs.